What are some of the common lies or misconceptions you see on the internet regarding manifestation?
I think one of the biggest challenges is this narrative the universe cares about you. The universe doesn't give a shit about you, frankly. I mean, as you know from the first sentence in the book, it says the universe doesn't give a fuck about you. And it's not meant in a negative way. What happens to so many people, though, is they give their agency away to others. And whether it's the universe with some belief that through the law of attraction, which is another common narrative in the world of manifestation, this idea that somehow if you put out positive thoughts to the universe listens, and positive thoughts beget positive thoughts, and suddenly you get what you want. And I think that is one fallacy. And I think the other is the narrative, as you may have seen from The Secret, and a lot of informations that's promulgated related to manifestation is that it's about me. I want this, I want that, and if I just put it out there, I'm going to get it. And whether that's making $1 million a year, a new Ferrari, living in a mansion, that just doing that will make it happen. And that's not true either. And in fact, the reality is that when you focus just on me, I want, actually, that can be very negative to a lot of people. And certainly I can tell you that from my own experience.
So, what exactly do you think is happening when people anecdotally say, I manifested this, I changed my frequency, I changed my energy, and I was able to make more money, I was able to attract a relationship, I was able to change my mindset, I was able to recover from addiction? What exactly is going on there that's different from what they may believe?
Well, I think that, first of all, you can use what is popularly mentioned in books like The Secret and stuff to manifest. Inherently, the statements are not necessarily incorrect in the sense of what you need to do. And that is either visualization technique or utilizing your senses in a way in which you use repetition and creation of habit to change your mindset or give yourself your own self agency. Again, though, I think it's how you view things. One is saying, oh, there's something out there that cares about me, and that by making a deal with it or offering positive statements, I'm going to get it, versus saying, I have an understanding of how my brain works. And by embedding my intention into my subconscious, that will activate certain cognitive brain networks, which then will work together to create situations or look for situations that enhance my ability to manifest or make my intention become a reality. And while the differences are subtle, they're still very important.
And when you talk about the word intention, I think that's also thrown around a lot, being intentional with your actions and your behaviors and your beliefs. And I think sometimes people can be confused. How do you define what an intention is? And then how do you actually begin to embed that into your brain so that your brain starts to change and picking up on what exactly it is you want?
Well, I'm sure you've heard the statement, what fires together wires together. And we know that through creation of habit, we can lay down new neural pathways or strengthen neural pathways that by doing so increase the likelihood for those pathways to occur at all or to function more efficiently. The downside here, or the aspects that people may forget here, are as follows. One is everyone is manifesting every day. And that's just thinking and saying, I want to go from point A to point B. I mean, that very narrative is itself an intention. The difference is that, like so many things, as an example, athletics, you don't start out when you wake up in the morning as an elite athlete. All of us start out as knowing extraordinarily little about a domain. And then through repetition, knowledge, we learn more and more and become efficient at it. So if I was going to run a marathon tomorrow, I don't jump out of bed and run 26 miles and say, hey, I did it. You have to have a plan. You have to start. But the other important aspect, I think, of all of this is an understanding, one, of the baggage you already carry which for many people defines every decision they make, whether it's for a job, a relationship. And I'm sure you've seen people who you talk to them and go, gosh, I don't understand it. I'm going through my third divorce, and every one of these people was an alcoholic and an abuser. What's going on here? Well, most people actually don't sit down and have an appreciation of understanding the neural pathways or habits that have already been embedded within them through their childhoods. And of course, there are very particular areas in our childhood, and this is the nature of bonding or attachment theory, in which certain pathways are laid down. And if they're not laid down, if you will, in a positive way, then those habits still get embedded. As an example, many people come from challenging backgrounds growing up, not only myself, but many other people. But if you have a person who is abusive in some way, either physically or mentally, or even sexually, and then afterwards they sit there and they tell you they love you, then you have this confusion, right? Between, well, is love always associated with this negative event? And many people, unfortunately, have that embedded in them. So you have to understand, what is it that you're already manifesting? And then the other thing, which I alluded to and referred to The Secret, but other books in this popular domain, which is understanding the difference between what you think you want and what you actually need. And what I mean by that is that, unfortunately, our Western capitalist society, for many people, defines success as money, power, and position. And I would suggest you it's a false narrative, because quote unquote success for many people equates with happiness. And of course, I'm sure you know from your own experience and that of others, in no way is that true whatsoever. And another aspect is, and in some ways, this goes back to our evolution as a species. Hundreds of years ago, we used to live in villages, and we would be born there. We would die there. We would have intergenerational families. The community supported us. They wanted us to thrive, and they did not judge us. And the problem is, as we have evolved, quote unquote, into the modern world, we are in a situation where you don't have relatives, you don't have a support system, and people are terrified of being judged. And so then this has led to this sense of a requirement for external affirmation about you being okay. And this also plays into this Western capitalist narrative of what success is. So by holding things out there and say, I'm okay, I have this nice house, I have this great job, I drive this fancy car, look at me, I'm okay. And this is a method, and I will tell you for myself early on, you think that is an effective method for getting rid of your insecurity and your shame, but it does not in any way. And so the challenge is, you have one subset of people who do this and think they're showing everybody they're okay. But sadly, you have another set of people who believe that narrative and look at those people and go, oh gosh, I really want to be like that. And if I just get that, I'm going to be okay. And of course, it never works.
Right. I mean, from my own personal experience, I thought happiness for me was to, be ripped, to have all this money, to have success, to get attention from pretty women, to have all these things that were external, right? And then what I found was the only way that I actually became truly happy was when I started being of service. I started loving myself. I started to do things for the right reasons. I started to forgive other people. I started to gain a sense of purpose and meaning for my life. And it's like it's a trick, right? Because like you said, like society tells you the opposite. And I also think it's challenging because when you're trying to quote unquote manifest something internally or set a goal for something internally, it's hard to measure that. Like you can measure money, you can measure body fat percentage, you can measure the type of car you have or whatever. So how can somebody in the best way possible work on manifesting things internally so they can do things for the right reasons?
Well, it's hard, but I would suggest once you get rid of the external noise, you suddenly get a sense of what it is, right? You said yourself, being of service. And it's interesting because there's a very specific reason for that. As we evolved as a species, our species has a very small litter. Our offspring require us to care for them for well over a decade. And as a result, to do so, we have a genetic imperative. And what happens is when you care, you get the release of certain hormones or neurotransmitters. The most common one people have heard about is oxytocin, or the bonding, love, affiliation, caring hormone. And what happens is when that is released, your reward and pleasure centers are activated. So when you care, you feel good. And the other corollary to that is your physiology works at its best, as well as your cognitive brain networks. And so there's good reason why you feel good when you care for others. Unfortunately, in some ways, what we're talking about is the difference between a fear narrative and a love narrative. And what do I mean by that? This relates to the autonomic nervous system and how our brain functions. As you know, there are two parts, and this is through something called the vagus nerve. One part is the flight, fight, or freeze response, or the sympathetic nervous system, which is aggravated when you're fearful or threatened. The other is the parasympathetic nervous system, which many call the rest and digest system, which is actually your baseline, where you should be almost all of the time. As I mentioned earlier, though, the way our society has evolved, for many people, that threat mode is chronically activated. And the reason being is that you don't have family, you don't have friends, you don't have relatives surrounding you to give you that support that many of us need in environments of which we're not familiar. And so as a result, this actually aggravates this aspect of us being insecure or fearful. And therefore, what we try to do is to show people that we're okay. And that's by holding up these banners of things. And of course, this is through insecurity, this is through fear, this is through a sense of inadequacy. And the corollary to that, though, or the opposite, is the way in which we were meant to live. And that's with our parasympathetic nervous system engaged. When that is engaged, our cognitive brain networks function at their best. Our physiology functions at its best. Our longevity is actually increased, and we're much more thoughtful and discerning about decisions. But fundamentally, we look through the lens in our lives of caring for others, of being of service, of thinking about others versus being inwardly focused on ourselves.
And I think one of the hardest things for people when it comes to manifesting and transforming their life, and I know you went through your own struggles with this, both when you were younger and then when you had everything and lost everything, is like a lot of people want to achieve things and manifest things from a place of suffering. They get a divorce, they want to manifest a new relationship. They're going through childhood trauma, they want to manifest a new family. They're just trying to get out of, drug addiction. They want to manifest like long-term recovery, whatever the example is. And it's tough because like their thoughts of where they want to go are one thing, but their reality of where they are is another. And there's this cognitive dissonance that exists. How can people conquer that? How can people overcome those limiting beliefs to actually begin to make some positive momentum in their life?
Well, I think you just made an important statement, which is limiting beliefs. Henry Ford made a statement: if you believe it's possible, it is. If you believe it's impossible, it is as well. And I think that unfortunately, many people either are told by others that they can't, it's not possible, or through other reinforcement, believe that that's the case. And again, once you say, I cannot, it is not possible, that is truth. And so most people actually in this world limit their beliefs. They don't appreciate how powerful their brain really is, and how, with really not tons of training, but with minimal training, you can actually change your entire life. You just have to believe it, though. And it's interesting because, yes, you could sit there and say, everything comes from the universe, I'm praying to the universe, and magic happened. And in some ways, that could work. The reality, though, that's not what is really happening. You have to understand that you have complete control of how your brain works in many ways. What I tell people is this negative self talk that so many people have, I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I don't deserve, that is not you and it's not truth. But in my own situation, I believe that. And this is something called negativity bias because we are always attuned to threat. And unfortunately, that gives rise to negative self talk. And the reason we're attuned to threat is that's what puts our lives at risk. And so we're always searching for that. And the sad thing, too, is, and I don't know if you've experienced, but I know many people have, and I have certainly, you will tell someone a dream, an aspiration that you want to accomplish. And they'll say, you'll never do that. You can't do that. And what the person is telling you is they can't do it, but they don't want you to do it either. And so one of the strengths I got from childhood from this woman who I met in this magic shop was a firm belief in myself. Because if I listened to every person who told me, as an example, my school counselor, you're never going to make it in college, you should probably look at going to a trade school. Or in college, the counselor saying, you don't have the grades to go to medical school, so we're not going to give you the interview. Or even during my residency, when I was told, well, there's a 3-year wait here, and while we'll consider you, you still have to wait for 3 years. If I believed any of that, I wouldn't be where I am today. And the thing is, so many people are willing to accept others' limiting beliefs in themselves. I think one of the first things is to understand you have the power within you. And when you make these set negative comments about yourself, it's as if you're building a prison and you're laying down a brick every time you make a negative comment. And as the walls get higher and the room gets darker, that further exacerbates the situation and makes you want to truly believe that. Yet, every one of us has in our pocket the key to open the door. We just have to understand it. And once you realize that, then you have unlimited possibilities in your own potential.
I mean, I've definitely experienced what you just said in like limiting myself and having these limiting beliefs that I'm not going to be able to achieve anything, or having people in my life that are talking down to me or telling me that my dreams or what I want to accomplish in life is just too big. And that's why I always tell people, like, you got to spend time with people that have common futures and not common pasts, because otherwise you'll end up spending time with people that end up weighing you down or bringing you down, because you're still caught up like in your past life with them.
Well, I just want to say that's an excellent quote, which I'm going to steal.
Thank you. Thank you. I know from your story, like, you had this magical experience in the magic shop, no pun intended. And then you learned about the power of manifestation and having these mindset shifts that you just talked about. But then, like, you experience something that a lot of people experience, is that you have a bunch of success, things are going really well in your life, and then they're not, and you lose everything. And then people's belief system at that time collapses. And a lot of times it stays there. How did you use what you've learned and your own education and experience with everything to reestablish belief in yourself after losing it all?
The problem I had was that when I first started, if you will, visualizing or manifesting through the techniques that Ruth in the Magic Shop taught me, I was 12 or 13 years old and I was poor. And those two factors led me to believe the common societal belief about what success is, which is what we've been talking about. You know, Ruth had me make a list of 10 things I wanted. And one, I had wanted to be a doctor since I was in 4th grade. And certainly I wanted to help people. But the other part of it was I wanted to be able to say, I'm a doctor, I'm important, look at me, right? Because, you know, being a doctor is respected in society. It's a high position for many people. And the other was I wanted to live in a big house. I wanted a mansion. I wanted $1 million, which in 1968 seemed like a lot of money. And I wanted a Porsche and I wanted a Rolex, all of these external markers of success. And I got every one of them. I did what is commonly thought of as the techniques to manifest. I used, and just to go over those very quickly, basically what you have to do to manifest is embed your intention into your subconscious. And we can go into this a lot more and how the brain networks work. But fundamentally, the way to create and strengthen these pathways is you have to use your sensory organs. And that is to write it down, to read it silently, to read it aloud, to see yourself in that position, and repeat it over and over again. And these are very common techniques which are used and which are very useful. So I achieved every one of those things. But as I said earlier, there's a difference between what you think you want and what you actually need. I thought I wanted these things because I was in the fear mode. I was insecure. I didn't have confidence. And I believe that if I just get these things, when people look at me, they'll think I'm okay and I deserve the invitation to the party. And that's not what gives you the invitation to the party whatsoever. So imagine here I am, and I've achieved these things. I have a 8,000 square foot home overlooking Newport Bay in Southern Cal. I have a penthouse on the top of a building in San Francisco. I have a villa in Florence overlooking the Arno River. I'm buying an island in New Zealand. I have a Porsche, a Ferrari, a Mercedes, a Range Rover, a BMW in the garage. I'm dating all these starlets. I have all my friends telling me how great I am. Yet, in the face of all of this, I was never more miserable than I had ever been in my entire life, because it's like I'm living in this dream, but it's a dream. It's not real. And nothing is worse than sort of, I mean, don't get me wrong. It's great to drive a Ferrari on some level, but when you're driving it because you want to be seen driving your Ferrari, those are two different things. And that's where I was at. And it wasn't until I lost everything. And as you know, I had made some big bets during the dot-com period and lost, when the crash came, about $78 million and was effectively $3 million in the hole. And that does get your attention. And what happened was I went through a significant period of reflection. I went back to this house that I had overlooking the bay, which was pretty much empty. And I went through this period of reflection to understand what had happened to me and what were the lessons that I hadn't listened to. And again, the difference was what I heard, I thought was, I deserve this, I should get this, I want this, and that's okay. Versus what I should have heard was be of service, care for others, and you'll get everything you need. And those are two completely different narratives. And so when I shifted my focus from me to we, everything changed. So I tell the story, it's a rags to riches story, literally. And then it's back to rags, but that's figuratively, because when I lost everything, I was still a neurosurgeon. I was making more than 99.9% of people. But what I got was when I changed my perspective, which was being of service and looking through the lens of compassion and caring and recognize that everyone is suffering. As a result, I created the center at Stanford, which studies the neuroscience of compassion and altruism. The Dalai Lama became the founding benefactor. He and I became friends. This led to me becoming chairman of the Dalai Lama Foundation and a close relationship with him. It then allowed me to meet many of the leading spiritual and religious leaders in the world, Desmond Tutu, Thich Nhat Hanh, Sogyal Rinpoche, Amma the Hugging Saint, Sadhguru, Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Eckhart Tolle, Byron Katie, and a variety of others. And Bina, you mentioned this quote of yours, people from your past versus people in the future. That was my future I saw. People who live above this dogma of religion, but care about others, see everyone as a part of one wholeness. And that was very powerful, and it changed everything.
So people might be listening to this or watching this and they're like, oh, all I have to do now is just be of service and do things for others, and things will start to come to me. And I think based on what I know from your work and what I've heard you say, yes, that's true. And like, you can't be a martyr and be very codependent and a people pleaser and just give your life away to everybody else. And that, because you hear that often, like the more I give, the more I'm going to receive, right? Like you just hear people, and then sometimes people do things for the wrong reasons.
No, I think you're right. In fact, there's a whole personality, and we talked about this briefly earlier, of a lot of people who've suffered end up being givers, and then people take advantage of them. So you do have to have limits on how much you give, because then you're creating a second problem. You mentioned codependency. You start saying, "Oh, well, I get my satisfaction from doing all this stuff for other people." Well, that burns out really quickly, and unfortunately, a lot of people take advantage of your kindness. And now, if you ask me, would you rather people take advantage of your kindness versus being a prick? I don't necessarily mind it on some level, but I'm certainly attuned to it. And again, another thing you mentioned is at some point, there are people who are users, or what do they call them? Energy vampires. And best thing you can do for you ultimately is to get rid of them. There's nothing that says you have to put up with people like this. Now, the nature of reality is sometimes you have to interact, but you don't have to engage beyond the most minimal. So, yes, giving is a wonderful thing, but I also want to tell you that I am not anti-materialistic. What I'm saying, though, is the difference is, as an example, listen, I live in a very, very nice house. I drive a Porsche. I have a Range Rover. I have no problem at all with those things. The difference is, though, if all of that is gone tomorrow, my mental state in no way changes, because the narrative isn't about, see, I have these things, look at me. The narrative is, I like to drive my Porsche. I like to live in a nice house. I like to swim in my pool. So it's not being anti-materialistic. It's about understanding what's important and also not having attachment to things. Again, attachment and craving is one of the greatest causes of suffering.
Let's get into the meat and potatoes, if you will, a little bit. We've talked about like some of the biggest, I guess, misconceptions about manifestation that's out there. And we also have talked about like what kind of needs to happen as a whole for you to be able to manifest things properly. What are some things that somebody could do, like whether it's every morning or on a daily basis, that they can begin to stack some of these small wins to start to embed their intention in their subconscious and be able to maximize manifestation in their life?
Well, as I said earlier, I mean, one of the most important things is to understand what you've already been manifesting, because if you don't address that issue, you're just going to be in this endless cycle. And that may require actually therapy or speaking to someone or just reflection, and perhaps even with a journal to understand what is it about your past that's taken you to this point. I think the other thing, which we've already talked about, is the difference between what you think you want and what you actually need. And again, to make your physiology work at its best, to make your brain networks function at their best, to be back at that baseline where we should be almost all of the time, requires you to be in your parasympathetic mode, if you will. And you can get there many ways, but one way that's very common and that's very effective is a meditation or a mindfulness practice, limiting your self-talk. And then once you're able to do that, you can start moving forward. But there's certain other caveats. One is, as I mentioned, attachment. And I think you and I had mentioned this a little bit earlier. Climbing to the top of the mountain or being totally buffed and, having minimal body fat or whatever it is, at what price? And so we get into our heads sometimes that if I just do this, and you kill yourself to do that, yet on the path to doing that, you stand on top of the mountain and you're completely alone. And the problem is that if you sacrifice every relationship, everything that's makes a human life worthwhile, you are doing the exact opposite of what you should be doing, because nothing is fulfilling by having dying alone with nothing. It's like these guys who chase after billions of dollars, and they're absolutely ruthless to get there. Their whole life is one of display, and then they die alone, or they die with people who have used them over the years and could care less about them. So you have to sit there and say, what is my purpose? What am I trying to achieve? And why am I here? And I would suggest to you that, and this is the difference between hedonic happiness, eudaimonic happiness. Hedonic happiness falls into the material world, if you will. We're chasing pleasure, avoiding pain. And again, that is typically through a fear narrative versus eudaimonic happiness, which is associated with purpose and meaning. Humans get purpose and meaning through being of service, from caring about others. And that is what almost all of us strive to do. When you are focused on hedonic happiness, it's as if you're eating a meal that has no calories and you're always hungry for more and more and more. Versus if you focus on being of service, of caring for others, you are satiated and you feel full. And in fact, far down the road, when you think about those experiences of what you did for somebody, it actually gives you this deep feeling of warmth and fulfillment and sustenance. And that is what makes a human life of value. I am sure you have run across a lot of people who endlessly chase hedonic happiness, and you watch them, and sometimes you can just look at them and they know that they're living a lie. And this is like influencers. I'm sure you've seen many of them. You know, these people, you take away the filters, you take away all the other stuff, the makeup, and you see that that's not them at all. And the horrible part is there's a subset of people who are looking at these influencers just saying, God, they have a great life. And the fact of the matter is they don't. And if you chase that, you're going to be just as unhappy ultimately as them. And that's why we see so many of these people who are depressed chronically or even commit suicide.
This episode is brought to you by Element. Whether or not you're working out, hydration is so important. Water alone is key, but drinking water on its own sometimes just doesn't cut it. That's where Element electrolytes come in. They have formulated a science-backed electrolyte ratio that tastes absolutely amazing. Plus, it doesn't have any sugar, artificial colors, or other sketchy ingredients to hold you back. I've been using Element for years, and my favorite flavor is definitely the citrus salt. I take it either first thing in the morning when I wake up or after a workout or a run. After taking it, I always feel replenished and ready to move on to the next thing I am doing. I know when I am properly hydrated, I perform and feel my best. So if you're looking to optimize your hydration, go to drinklmnt.com/DougBopst to get a free sample pack with any purchase. Again, go to drinklmnt.com/DougBopst or click the link below for a free sample pack with any purchase. Now back to the show. So now that people can be focused on the right things and they realize the importance of being of service, having compassion, not chasing after the external in order to maximize like what they want in life. You talked earlier about like using your senses in order to embed this intention into the subconscious mind to be able to begin to compound manifesting things in the future. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. Most people don't appreciate that our sensory organs actually result in us receiving about 10 million bits of information every second. 99.999 actually are associated with maintaining homeostasis or normal bodily functions. But we have the ability on a conscious level to process about 50 to 100 bits of information a second. And that's where it all lies. There's something that is called value tagging. And what happens there is that on a conscious level, we have the ability to embed an intention. And as we talked about earlier, the most powerful way to do it is by writing it down, repeating it aloud, silently, et cetera, and over again. And that puts it into your subconscious. Well, what happens then? Well, there's a part of your brain or an area in your brain called the default mode network. And this is self-referential. It is associated with mind wandering or daydreaming, but this is where you create the narrative of who you are or what you want. And this is where you embed this intention that you have tagged as important to you. And once that has happened, the task positive network, which is basically 3 areas in the brain, are activated. And the first is what we call your salience network. The nature of you embedding it has made it salient or important. And it's, as I used in the book, the example of you placed it in a file and put it in a filing cabinet of your subconscious. And then once it's there, there's a bloodhound there that senses that that is important. And what it does then is it directs your attention network that that is important and it should be focused on. Once those two areas have been activated, the attention and the focus and the salience, then this comes to the executive control network, which actually makes things happen. Or, if you will, as the CEO, it takes that information and then acts upon it. And many times you don't appreciate what has happened. As an example, I'm sure you have been at a party and it's very loud. And yet, in the face of how loud it is, if somebody says your name, you turn to it. You cannot help. And the reason is because for years, your identity is extraordinarily important. So your subconscious is always attuned to situations where your name is mentioned because it has implications. The same is true when you are effectively embed an intention. As an example, there's a project I've been working on for some time, and I was at a coffee shop a few months ago. And this is not the terminology associated with this is fairly scientific. So it's not that the average person would be, having this conversation. Yet in the din of all the noise in this busy coffee shop, I heard two words that are very specifically associated with that topic, and which led me to get up and introduce myself to these individuals. And it turns out we have a common interest, and now we're working on this project together. And the reason I mention that is because your subconscious is always looking for opportunities where it can help your intention manifest. And you can call it synchronicity or coincidence, but that's what happens. As an example, as a neurosurgeon, I see a lot of patients, and I'll tell a patient that they have a condition, let's say a meningioma, which is a benign tumor in the brain. And they'll sit there and go, my God, I've never heard of that before. That must be really rare. And then I'll see them in 2 months and they go, it's the most amazing thing. I've run into 6 people with the same condition. Well, the reason is because they have embedded it through their own fear and are attuned to any situation where that might come up and listen to that. And suddenly it's there. It's like seeing a car that may be purple and you go, God, I've never seen that model in a purple. That's strange. And then suddenly you see several of them over a few days.
That's wild. So when you talked about journaling, that's something that's become widely popular over the years. Is this a practice you recommend doing like every day, every morning? And then on top of that, like, could you provide an example of like how to effectively like write out like an intention?
Again, everybody has different ways to do things. I think, when you said journaling's rare, actually, there has always been a subset of people who journal and sometimes obsessively, which isn't necessarily good either. If you spend 3 hours a day journaling, I'm not sure how effective you are. But I think the most important part is one, taking the time to understand what is important to you, what will fulfill you, and then just listing those. And once you do that, what I would do when I was younger is I would, as I said, I would think about that list. I would write the list down. I would read the list silently. I would read it aloud. I would then think of myself in each one of these, what it would be like being that or having that. And those are the ways to embed your intention. And so journaling about, as an example, there's a young lady I mentioned in the book named Anula who wanted to be a doctor. And the difference was she wanted to be a doctor to make her parents happy versus wanting to be a doctor to help people. Once she changed how she saw that and she actually ended up journaling, it was a different narrative and it actually calmed her down because it was no longer the fear of disappointing her parents. It was the enthusiasm and the pleasure of being of service.
And so for you, what are some of your best practices now to keep the manifestation flowing in your life? Like, what do you do on a daily or weekly basis for yourself?
I read my book.
Shameless plug. Read Mind Magic every day.
At least 20 or 50 times. And in fact, buy one for every person you know, because that will manifest my success. Actually, it's funny you say that, because I tell people, look, don't buy my book. Go to the library and check out my book. That way you don't have to spend any money. That being said, if you want to buy the book, I appreciate that, but I would recommend you go to bookshop.org, which is for independent booksellers and not some of these megaliths like Amazon. But regardless, there are several things I do. One is I have a daily meditation practice. And I've been meditating for many, many years. So on many levels, it's slightly different for me. But one of the things that I think challenges people, as soon as they hear the word meditation or mindfulness, they get afraid, because they think there's a right way and a wrong way. And if they do it the wrong way, that creates stress and anxiety because they believe it's the wrong way. But the reality is, putting yourself in a situation where you're not distracted, where it's calm, and you can simply reflect, that is a meditation. And it can even be like, I sometimes walk in the forest where it's quiet, nobody's necessarily bothering me. I can just reflect and go over issues that are in my head. That is also a form of meditation. You don't have to sit on a mat in a Buddhist temple with your fingers up like this to meditate. Okay. And so I think one is actually creating the right environment for you to be thoughtful and to be present, because unfortunately, 80% of the time, people are living in the past, thinking about what they could have, should have, might have done, or a future which hasn't occurred yet. And so thinking about where you are, who you are, what you want to be, and simply being puts you really in the right mindset. And once you can clarify what it is you truly want, and this is really hard for some people, and you have to get, again, out of your head what society tells you you should want. And once you clarify that, then you start doing the practice, which we've been describing. And again, I'm not anti-materialistic. I'm just saying, though, that your focus should be on being of service. You get all the other stuff you want. If you want that Porsche, that Ferrari, the big house, you can get that. But what happens to so many people is, once they do this type of reflection, they understand that they were chasing something that was not going to give them fulfillment, and they change. And so on the one hand, what I say is, there's nothing wrong with materialism. It's just you have to put it in the right context and make sure that that is not why you're doing things. Once you do these practices, I think for many people, it can be extraordinarily powerful. There are a couple other things, though, that I think are very important. We talked about attachment. There's nothing wrong with having a goal that you work extraordinarily hard for. But if it doesn't occur, you need to let it go and move on. There's a famous tennis player, and he gives a wonderful talk. I think it's Federer, but he sits there and says, "Look, I have failed a million times, but I don't focus on that failure over and over and over again. I did the best I could. I'm thoughtful about perhaps what may have happened. I may try to improve that." But the point isn't not to try to relive it. The point is just to get better at what I'm trying to do. And so not having attachment or defining yourself by that negative event allows you to move forward. The other thing is simply understanding who you are and accepting who you are. What happens for so many of us is that we carry a shadow self. And the shadow self is this part of us who we don't like. We find it embarrassing, these thoughts we have or actions we've done, and we're ashamed of them. And we don't want anybody to find out about it. And a lot of people, and this is very common, is they have a tendency to try to push it away and act like it's really not part of them. And the problem is, the more you push it away, the more it's going to surprise you when you're tired, when you are under pressure, when you're hungry. When you haven't been rested, and then it suddenly comes out. And this is unfortunately why a lot of people fail in addiction, is because they keep trying to push it away and not accept it as part of themselves. And once you accept it and understand that it's okay because everybody has this shadow. And also not to hide the reality that all of us are frail, fragile human beings. I'm sure you've probably heard of this term kintsugi.
I haven't.
What the hell's going on, Doug? Come on, man. Get your shit together.
I'm sorry. I can't know everything. I can't give you a gem of a quote in an episode and then know
That's
every
true.
quote.
Okay. Then I forgive you. The reason I bring this up is I think it's an interesting point. And this also is attached to something called wabi-sabi, which you probably also haven't heard of if you haven't heard kintsugi. I still love you, Doug. I want you to know that.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it.
But kintsugi is this 15th or 16th century philosophy associated with the repair of pottery. And during those periods of time, pottery was very valuable. And if a piece broke, they would try to repair it so it didn't show. And ultimately, though, they changed where they repaired the pottery with golden glue. And this was actually to accentuate the fact that the pottery had been broken, but it was okay. And it's like all of us, so many people tried to hide their brokenness or the experiences they've had versus being proud of them because that's made them who they are. And I think that's a very powerful metaphor for how we should try to live. We don't hide ourselves to show that we're perfect, which is this narrative of things to say, I have all of these things, so I'm perfect. But to say, look, I am imperfect and it's okay. I am imperfectly perfect. And this combines with this another Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi, which is this concept of impermanence, incompleteness, and imperfection. And again, this is another narrative and metaphor for how we are. We're never going to be perfect. The world and our lives are impermanent, and we'll never be complete. And all of that is okay. That is the baggage that we carry as human beings. And if we're able to accept ourselves and say we're okay in the face of that, actually that solves many of the problems we're having. And it creates the pathway for you to manifest the things that you really need that will make you a better person versus chasing after things that are going to limit your ability to be the best person you can be.
It's so profound that you shared that. And I think that one of the things that people struggle with, myself included, when we're trying to make a change and we're trying to quote unquote like manifest something in our lives is patience. Like the thing that we want like isn't coming to us fast enough. So we either accelerate the wrong direction and we end up messing up whatever it is we're working on in the first place, or we quit because we're like, you know what, like it's not going to happen fast enough. I need to give into this instant gratification mindset that my brain is accustomed to. How can somebody begin to get better at being more patient when it comes to this stuff, but also like rewire their brain to be able to slow down a little bit and not be so addicted to this instant gratification?
Well, unfortunately, that's the nature of social media. Unfortunately, we, in a capitalist culture, we have entities that very specifically try to capture your attention and use all the tools of making you addicted to instant gratification. And unfortunately, it works, and because there's a money narrative behind it, sadly. But I think you brought up something that's really, really important and that I should have brought up actually earlier, which is there is a tendency to want when you want it. And it doesn't work that way. I have had certain goals or desires to accomplish something. And, some of them are well over a decade or a decade and a half old. And in the book, I talk about something called dispositional optimism, where you don't put a time frame on when something's supposed to manifest, but you have this complete confidence that at some point it will. So I think that's an important thing because, again, the whole point is to put yourself in a calm mode because when you're in a calm mode or you've activated your parasympathetic nervous system, you're open, you're thoughtful, you're generous, your cognitive brain networks and your physiology work at their best. And that's where you want to live. And so being in this calm state, you're not rushing things. You're not saying, I have to have this. If I don't have this, I'm going to be a failure. The other thing that's important is, as an example, you may sit there and say, I want to have this thing or whatever it is, or I want to accomplish this goal. and it doesn't happen. And you go, oh, I'm a failure. It didn't happen. Well, what happens sometimes is that our subconscious is much smarter than we are. And there are reasons why some things don't occur. And oftentimes it's for the better. So the fact that something does not occur either doesn't mean you're a failure or you're a loser. And again, this is what oftentimes is associated with this law of attraction. Well, if you'd really wanted it enough, it would have happened. Clearly, you don't care and you didn't want it enough. No, sometimes things just don't happen and they're not meant to happen. And so, again, this is this idea of attachment. So, by being able to let go, I think is also important. And again, in many, many ways, what we're talking about is how do I maximize my mindset to most likely get what I need while avoiding the aspects of what happens if you don't. And again, this is the nature of how do I live a full life and not beat myself up all the time.
So, from listening to your book and just hearing you speak today and on other interviews, it seems that, and again, not to sound, no pun intended on this, but you have to be intentional with setting your intention and manifesting. You can't be in this state of chaos or stress because you're going to end up chasing after something for the wrong reasons or end up potentially quitting on something because it's not happening fast enough because you're super stressed. Do you have any tips for people who are trying to get better at carving out some time throughout their day to be able to be more intentional about what it is they want in their life?
Well, I think one of the challenges for people, I'll tell you, this is also true of myself, oftentimes, is you get lost on useless stuff. It's called on our phone. It's dream. Is it dream scrolling or something?
Doom
Anyway,
scrolling, doom
yeah,
scrolling.
yeah. I mean, you sit there and you're going, gosh, and then you realize 45 minutes have passed and you've wasted all this time when you could have been doing something that was potentially more useful. So I think one thing that can be very helpful is to sit down and sort through your day every day. I mean, at night, I sit there and I go through my schedule the next day. And then what I try to do is to allocate times, one, where I don't do anything, I'm just relaxed, but two, where I sit down and again, I write down the things that are important to me. And then I focus on those for a period of time in a non-stress situation. I don't have, 10 people waiting to speak to me. I don't have somebody incessantly calling. I have a block of time where I can simply relax, focus on the things that are important to me to accomplish. And whether that is in a relationship, whether that's in some sort of aspect of my job, or simply how to be a better person and be of service to others. And again, taking the time to just be with yourself, not be anxious about what's happening next, and write it down and just look at it and think about it. I think that can be extraordinarily helpful for a lot of people because there, as much as I have said, and again, I'm often as guilty as anyone else, so I'm not trying to indicate to your listeners that Jim Doty has solved every problem and he's just this perfect guy and he gets his together. I still fuck up and I'm not perfect and I have made repeated mistakes and I will probably make repeated mistakes, but I will do the best I can. And I'm not going to tear myself apart because I'm a human being. I just try to do the best I can. And that's all any of us can do. You don't have to beat yourself up. And, trying to live up to false standards is really what damages so many of us. And whether that's, these influencer networks or whatever, everybody's human. You can't be perfect. None of us are going to be perfect. And it's okay. You are worthy as you are. You deserve love. You deserve acceptance. And you're perfectly fine. All of us are struggling, but you just have to have the sense that you're trying to do the best you can. You don't get lost in beating yourself up, and you try to improve the things about you that you feel could help you and people around you.
So many people who have had a lot of success in their life and they've stuck to it, they talk about the importance of stacking small wins. Like the person who goes out and is able to run the Boston Marathon, they didn't just pick up their running shoes one day and run the marathon. They started by walking and then jogging and then running. What's going on like in the brain? Like what is these small wins actually doing from a like a neuroscience perspective that's enabling themselves to build more confidence and self-esteem and trust in themselves?
Well, this is the nature of discipline and habit, right? And as we talked about earlier, nobody runs a marathon the first day. And by doing these small wins, it actually strengthens these neural pathways and gives you confidence. And it changes your mindset because nothing is more depressing than go, I'm going to run a mile today. And you get out there and you get like 300 yards. You go, God, man, I can't do it. And then you like immediately go, God, I'm never going to be able to do this versus picking something reasonable and say, I'm going to walk to the corner today. If I can do that, that's fine. And tomorrow I'll take another step further. It's those little wins where you sit there and go, God, I actually did more than I thought I could today. And, one of the lessons I learned from an individual, he said, you can always do 40% more than you believe. Now, whether that's true or not, I have no clue.
Is that David Goggins who said that?
Yes, that was David Goggins. And that's why I didn't mention his name, because there are other issues perhaps that aren't ideal. But the point is that you can actually always do more than you believe you can. So I always sit there, and when I've done the thing I said I was going to do, whether it's going up the hill or walking to the corner, I'll take another 20, 30 steps to just go a little bit further and say, hey, I did more than I thought I could do today. And you just keep doing that. And each time you do a little bit more and you go, I did more than I thought I could today. Again, this creates the mindset. It attunes your body. It affects your physiology because if you look at it, you look at a guy like Wim Hof or some of these Tibetan monks. These are guys who, in regard to the Tibetan monks, these guys have meditated for 10, 20, 30,000 hours. And again, these are deeply embedded habits. So they are able to gain access to parts of their physiology that most of us would never be able to do through this habit change. And so you can change all sorts of things. I used to be very much into meditation, and I could control my heart rate, as an example, and lower it or raise it by 20, 30 beats a minute, just through meditation practice. And again, also, whether it's being out in the cold, I could look and sort of put my state that my hands were on fire, if you will, and they would get warm. I mean, all of these things are available to each of us. We just have to take the time and through habit do it. But the most important thing, as you pointed out, is it doesn't happen just because you wake up one day and you go, okay, I'm going to do it, and that's going to work. Again, it takes practice, dedication. And that's really one of the most important things about anything. You have to show up.
Is there any time frame you recommend somebody putting on their goals? You said that at some point somebody should give up, right? Like, is there any time you suggest waiting?
I didn't mean that you sit there and go, okay, well, I didn't do it in this time frame. I'm a loser, so I'm never going to. I didn't really mean it quite that way. Sometimes there are time frames that we don't have control over. But that being said, you can have a time frame in your mind that you want to have something happen. It doesn't have to be hard and fast. And I think if you reach that and it has not happened, you have to simply sit down and look at the situation. Is there any indicator that things are moving forward? Is this really what I want? What are the things that potentially are preventing this from happening? And again, reassess, adjust, and then go from there.
Last question I have for you is, other than not focusing so much on the external stuff, what advice would you give your 30 or 40-year-old self?
1, be more thoughtful. And 2, be more disciplined. I oftentimes wasn't as disciplined as I should have been. It's easy retrospectively to sit there and have these discussions. But I think, as an example, Warren Buffett made a comment one time, although I'm not sure if he actually believes it because he drinks Coca-Cola and fried chicken. But he made a comment, you only have one body. And basically, you have a mind and you have a body, and they're not replaceable necessarily. And if you take care of your body and you're thoughtful and you do that consistently, then the likelihood of you having it fail on you in the future is much decreased. And so I think focusing your attention on not having the perfect body, but taking care of yourself. And what are the 4 things to take care of yourself? It's exercise, it's sleep, it's diet, and it's mindset. And fundamentally, those four things, if you can master those for yourself, will not only lead you to a long life, but will lead you to a full life.
Real quick, what is the impact of like taking care of your health and fitness on the ability to manifest? Like, how does it impact the brain? And
if you're stressed and anxious, which then affects not only your cognitive brain networks, but also your physiology, then that significantly impacts it. As an example, if you're in the fear mode, this actually shuts down your executive control network. Because when you're in the fear mode, you're in survival mode. You don't need a million choices about what you're going to do. You need one to survive. So you don't have access to memory, experience to make discerning decisions. You're just trying to survive in the present moment. And so that affects your ability to manifest. And again, when you have the chronic release of stress hormones or the effects of stress hormones, which affect your blood pressure, your cardiac function, your immune system, the expression of inflammatory proteins, you're not going to function physiologically at your best, and you're going to have other issues. So having a attuned self mentally and physically is the best place to be. And that makes obviously very logical sense. But again, people are human beings. We're not going to be, or at least very few people are going to be able to say absolutely disciplined, 99.9% of the time. For most people, that is not possible. And it's wonderful if you can do it. And perhaps you should try for that, but don't beat yourself up if you're not. That's why, you look at professional athletes as an example. What percentage of people become a professional athlete of the average person? It's probably 0.01 or 0.001%. Well, why is that? One, it has to do with genetics. As an example, Wim Hof does extraordinary things, but I would suggest you, like every professional athlete, they have connected a genetic imprint with something they're interested in, and it's an ideal combination. Versus the average person, you or I will probably not be Wim Hof or be a marathon runner because our genetics are not necessarily there. It doesn't combine with our interests or our abilities. And whether it's being, Mick Jagger, again, it's a combination of genetics with the right situation with something you're interested in. So you look at people, and you mentioned David Goggins. I mean, as you know, he's a fellow. What does he do? He wakes up at 4 a.m. He runs a half a marathon. He weightlifts for 4 hours. He's done these things where he's run, 150 miles and his feet are bleeding. Well, that takes an immense amount of discipline. Now, why you would do that or for what purpose, frankly, remains unclear to me. But regardless, is that possible? Yeah, but it's not possible for most people. So don't beat yourself up by somehow thinking, I'm going to be the next David Goggins. There are very few people who will ever be like him. And it's true of every one of these athletes. So you have to sit there and say, how can I be the best self for which I have been given the genetics and interests? And that is what you should be, not some sort of unattainable thing. And again, I hate to get back to these influencers, but you look at these people, what they're promoting is unattainable for the vast majority of people. And don't get lost in suffering because of that.
Dr. Doty, this has been an incredible conversation. I thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you, and I think the audience is going to really enjoy this conversation as well. You talked about Mind Magic. If they want to buy that, you mentioned the library, but if they want to actually buy the book or your previous book, or if they want to learn more about what you're doing, where's the best place to do so?
Certainly, you can go to my website, jamesrdotymd.com. You can go to mindmagicbook.com. You can go to intothemagicshop.com. But probably just jamesrdotymd.com has everything. Plus, obviously, you can go to Amazon, bookshop.org, the library. But my website pretty much has everything you need to know and probably some stuff you don't want to know about me. And also, for those who might be interested, I also have a podcast myself. It's not as successful as yours, Doug. I'm just a humble neurosurgeon, a humble country neurosurgeon. Check that out if you're interested, because there's some interesting folks there as well who might also give you insights in other different areas.
Awesome. Well, I encourage people to go check that stuff out. And Dr. Doty, thanks again for coming on the podcast. Like I said, I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.